This is a ballsy thing. I want to be very clear. It's not that easy for most security officers to do, is to actually allow AI to come into their networks to do some form of autonomous defense.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Gary Bowles. In this episode of Possible Futures, I talk with Jaya Baloo, one of the most respected voices in cybersecurity and quantum strategy, about the invisible architecture that keeps our digital lives safe and why it's all at risk. Jaya has spent over 2 decades protecting some of the world's most critical infrastructure, from leading security at major European telecoms to helping steer billion-euro quantum initiatives for the European Union. Today, she's a global advisor on how to navigate the looming intersection of cybersecurity, AI, and quantum computing. In this conversation, we pull back the curtain on what lawful surveillance really means, how quantum computing could break the encryption that we all rely on, and why the biggest vulnerability might not be technological, but human. Whether you're a technologist, an executive, or just someone trying to keep your data safe, this episode will challenge the way you think about digital security and remind you why our future resilience depends as much on people as it does on code. So let's dive in.
Thanks for having me, Gary.
I'm looking forward to hearing about this. So I wanted to start with young Jaya. What fascinated you as a child? What drew your interests?
To be honest, I think I was like every kid. I was inspired by the movies. I was inspired by TV shows. I did not know it, but I was a very young geek, nerd, whatever you want to call it. I didn't acknowledge that about myself. And I think it's more difficult in a way for girls to kind of figure out that's what they are sometimes. In the time that I grew up, for sure, I was interested in computers at a very early age. And I was incredibly fortunate to, from the age of 9, have a course in BASIC, learn how to program. I had a Commodore 64 for Christmas because I begged. And, so it was great. I got very lucky in the sense of being able to play with some of the things I was curious about.
And so how did that start to lead into what you decided to do?
I have this problem that I find a lot of things incredibly interesting. And then I find it a bit of a distraction because I genuinely can get extremely passionate about a diversity of subjects. And it actually limits you in some way because, where some people are very easy to choose a thing, you really have to think about when you like a lot of things. And when other people tell you how good you are at a whole bunch of things, it becomes harder to choose. And so there's like a sort of phase where you're learning about something and it's really, really interesting. And then you get good enough to do the thing, to really do it for real. And when you get there, that's when I think you have to understand whether or not it is for you. And I don't think there are enough opportunities for people who are trying to figure out what they really like to do to have that kind of, taste test or sample in an easy way. Because when you get good enough to actually do the thing for real, then you realize what the actual task at hand is. And so anyway, I had this predilection to always try to sneak in computer science into all of the things. So my jobs in university were working in the lab, and fixing things. And I was always like, I suppose, tinkering or meddling, however you want to see that. And so that helped actually. And I think that tinkering or meddling is what got me to a level of proficiency, which then later, when I was actually working, allowed me to find a job in the field without actually having the qualifications that I should have had I been more confident about pursuing a hobby versus pursuing work.
Got it. And so that sort of led you eventually into sectors like telecom and banking, right?
Yes. Yeah. Because there was a real crunch looking for qualified people. And so even at the telecom industry specifically, there were lots of programs to train, et cetera. And so there was always an onboarding because it's not something, even those folks that actually had done computer science in university, they didn't have the background necessarily to work on these devices, like the ones that the telecom industry needed. So a lot of it was on the job training. I was really lucky And having an academic background does help you figure out things faster, read a bunch of stuff, and then, question it. So I don't ever regret studying something that is completely foreign to what I do as a profession. But I do think if I could do it all over again, I probably would have studied physics, to be really honest. I think I really would have enjoyed it. I think I would have had programming on the side.
Yeah, I'm going to say though that you've picked up quite a bit in your work in the work realm. So when did that sort of guide there start aiming towards security, especially cybersecurity?
Oh, so I was always interested in cybersecurity because I think anytime you learn anything, you want to know what the weak points of any system are and where or at least that's what I found interesting. I found, if everyone tells you this is the way you have to do something, I think I always found it interesting to say, what are the exceptions?
I'd say it's nothing but exceptions, actually.
So I think it's actually really, really interesting to think about security that way. That security, in a lot of times, is trying to find the best practice common denominators, trying to minimize the events in which you have exceptions, and trying to have like some form of consistency at the highest possible level of a particular operational set. That's basically how I would say a lot of it's obviously not how we operate now, because unfortunately there are still a lot of exceptions. We don't operate things consistently. Technology is not consistent. The thing that we design is not what actually is there in operations. So I think that presents challenges.
And then what about quantum computing? I think we're going to go back and forth between sort of the security realm, quantum computing, and then talk about the intersection. But when did quantum computing become fascinating to you?
Yeah, so actually that's a really interesting story because I was invited to the Geneva Press Club to give a talk on lawful interception. And lawful interception, let me be very clear, first of all, what that is and what that isn't. The idea is really that surveillance, if you think about it, surveillance is pretty much people intercepting your communications, usually at a grand scale, and generally without your explicit consent or knowledge. That's surveillance. That is not the intent of lawful interception. Lawful interception is not something that happens at a large scale. Although lawful interception is without your specific consent, someone consented to that stream of traffic being captured. And usually that's a judge that has to issue an order, or specific authorities that have been entrusted with this capacity. And then for specific cases, you can ask a operator of either telecom, voice, mobile, fixed, internet, etc., or an ISP to go and tap some very specific communications of a very specific party. And that's really like, I am okay with that, because I don't think that we should ever assume that there is a situation where everyone is good. I think the point is that there might be very specific conditions where you would actually need this capacity. And it's the job of everybody in this ecosystem to do it well. So make sure that the engineering is properly done so that you do have privacy preservation, you do have audit trails, you do have security built in. You are not revealing to the attacker that you're intercepting their traffic when you are. Those things, I find them really important to do it well. If you're going to do this stuff, make sure it's perfectly executed. This is why I was working in Lawful Intercept to do the design and operational implementation of that stuff. And then someone told me during that talk in Switzerland, where I came to give a talk about Lawful Intercept, that actually there are systems that are impossible to intercept. And I said, well, that cannot be true. If it's on the wire, we can intercept it. If it's off the wire and it's radio, we can intercept it. If it's satellite, we can intercept. So no, there's no such thing that is not interceptable. Forget it. And so then, and I said, well, of course, if things are encrypted, there's always a challenge for the authorities to figure out how to decrypt it. But yeah, no, it's fine. And then I tried to understand this further. And so that's when I was introduced to Gregoire Ribordy, who at the time was still at the University of Geneva, and he was working on creating quantum key distribution as a company. And it was the first European company that did this, and actually the longest running in this field. They're still there. And it's called ID Quantique. And this was before the company actually was, out there. It was when he was still at the university. And I thought it was such a cool thing. So this is where I became fascinated with the idea. So maybe I can explain, first of all, a key is what you use literally to or not literally, maybe euphemistically, to lock your communications. So let's say you have Alice and Bob, and they have the same kind of key, like they're using a symmetric key. So they have the same key to lock and unlock. And it's a very complex key because not anyone should be able to have this key. So they have to find, it could be a number, a letter, it could be what letters, whatever. But the point is, it's a complex, same key to lock and unlock. That's a symmetric encryption algorithm. The challenge there is to make sure that Alice and Bob are using the same key. So key exchange is difficult when you have complex symmetric algorithms, which then change maybe quite frequently. It's a challenge to get the keys to both parties or multiple parties. Then, what we use across the scale of the internet is something called public key cryptography, where you have, instead of a single key, you have an asymmetric. So you have a public-private key pair. You use your private key to unlock the communication. Or let me just say it this way. If Alice wants to send a message to Bob, she uses his public key to encrypt the message, and then he can decrypt the message using his private key. So there's a key pair at both Alice and Bob, which they can either encrypt messages to each other using that public version, so they know, how to get there. And then the private version they use to decrypt. I'm explaining this incredibly simply, but I hope that's clear now.
Some of the core concepts, just very briefly, what a key is and why that is so key, why it's so key to encryption.
Well, it's not quantum computing, it's quantum key distribution that we're speaking about when it comes to keys. And what we're saying is that quantum key distribution is the ability, like if you imagine that Alice and Bob are talking to each other, and there's a potential for an eavesdropper to listen in between their communications, what we're saying now is we're looking for the presence of Eve. So let's say that Alice and Bob are communicating over a piece of fiber, like a piece of dark fiber between them, and they are sending a little message, let's say. It's trying to figure out when that message is sent from Alice to Bob, if Eve is on the line, she will perturb this. And so then Bob knows, there's someone here. I cannot trust this, and I can explain actually how that works in more detail, but I don't think that's what you want me to do right now. I'll leave it there.
Help us understand then. So you were doing this talk and you became fascinated by quantum computing. Can you just give us the basics about, so the quantum arena has a lot of facets to it, but there's quantum computing, there's quantum simulation, and then there's sensing and metrology. Can you just give a brief explanation? I know impossible, but just how that works. And so it's just the basic concepts that people need, because when we talk about security, it's important for us to at least understand what we're talking about.
So let me just say, quantum is not one thing. First of all, quantum mechanics is something that was, thought about in the 1930s, Niels Bohr. There's a whole new way to look at physics. It's looking at the very, very small. Gravity happens on large scales. Quantum gravity happens on very small scales, and it's trying to understand these very small scale efforts or interactions that are happening. So if we say that quantum mechanics is a whole arena, when we look at this field of quantum technologies, the way that we're seeing it now is when quantum mechanics came out, it was like this revolutionary concept in physics. And now what we're looking at with quantum technologies and the applications of some of these principles of quantum mechanics in different applications for humanity, we're seeing these things also be a sort of second quantum revolution with the emergence of these applications. So the first big thing is, of course, quantum computing. It's using the principles of quantum mechanics to actually engineer compute. And by doing so, we will be able to have different architectures for our computing power, which will be able to better ask very specific scientific questions to. So things that we don't have the power literally to solve now with our current computers, we could potentially ask and solve with our quantum computers. And then we have, you have quantum simulation, which is using the same thing, principles of quantum mechanics to simulate environments that would also be able to get there in an intermediate phase where you don't have quantum computers. And then we also have sensors metrology, where you have to imagine that, again, these same quantum mechanical phenomenon can be used to engineer clocks. So more precise clocks, or also very precise sensor technology. And my favorite, I think it's actually fascinating, is this notion of measuring specific gravity. So the gravimeter, and we also use so many different types of measurements just in our modern day networks that you could also use it for like global navigation and, these kinds of systems that we already rely on. Without using quantum technologies, we can actually get those in a much better way by using quantum mechanics to deliver those same applied capacities. So I think it's actually really, really exciting. And if you take a look at the European.
And so what are some of the aspects of our industries and our lives when we hit that crossover point?
And the use cases be far more extensive than what we originally thought they would be. I think the same analogy can be applied to everything around quantum technologies. I think our ability to understand use cases now is framed by, to a certain degree, that skepticism, but also not the full comprehension of, we don't know who will use it down the road and what that great impact will be unless we actually have it a little bit in our hands. And you can do some of that tinkering and meddling that's required in order to have that expansive use case scenario. So for now, I think what's really wise to say is there are really amazing potential possibilities. I mean, if I hear one more time about nitrogen fixing being the killer use case, it will kill me. But I don't think that's it. I think the issue is that foundational questions in quantum information sciences and optimization problems, I think those are the kinds of areas where we'll see an immediate acceleration when we have a quantum computer. But what I really kind of occupy myself about is mitigating any negative impacts of quantum computing, specifically towards cybersecurity. And the negative impacts of quantum computing, for me, they are so terrifying only because of the fact that we don't know well, and you see this already with AI, we don't know well how to sort ourselves out and get ourselves ready before the technology is on the horizon. We don't know how to do that. So a very good example is that, the AI Act, et cetera, like it's a little bit after the fact, genies are rushing out of bottles. And then we're like, oh, maybe we should think about, what the ethical impact is and what the legislative norm should be and how we then have safeguards in place. And I think the same is true for quantum as well. And so those ethical aspects, as well as the relative required safeguards, are things I worry about, because quantum computing, as we know, can solve these very specific set of problems currently. That's our current estimation of it. And as a result of which, one of those sets of problems where there are already algorithms there to exploit this is around integer factorization, which is one of the hard problems in math that we use to protect our current cryptography. We already have new cryptographic algorithms that can be used even when you have a quantum computer, but I still worry about attacks there as well. So we see some of the proposed algorithms that were approved by NIST already being attacked, and not even with a quantum computer. I am worried about implementation failures, side channel attacks, things that were designed well in the protocol, but were not executed well in implementation, that actually cause us massive amounts of headaches in cybersecurity.
So let me make sure I'm sort of understanding the landscape. So we've got quantum computing that will just get better and better at solving harder and harder problems. And eventually it gets to the point where it can calculate so rapidly certain kinds of problems that it could basically do the kinds of cracking a code or key that might have taken thousands of years before, and it may be able to do it instantaneously. And so right now we're saying, well, we think we can guess what that might look like. So let's come up with new algorithms that might be protected from that. But we don't even know. We're just guessing what might be protected
Well, it's a different class of problem. So the point is, for the quantum computer now, we have this integer factorization algorithm. We already have it ready. It's just waiting for the architecture to run on. So we need a place to run this algorithm called Shor's algorithm, and you need a quantum computer of sufficient scale and stability, which means that it doesn't decohere. There's a stability in the amount of qubits, and that you can actually use your compute power on that. And when that's there, you can run Shor's algorithm, and you can probably do that integer factorization on an algorithm like RSA, which we use all over the internet, frankly, to encrypt our communications, our secret information. We use this everywhere. And so I do think it's a very real threat. The point about the threat, and I want to make this clear, is it's a hydra threat, in the sense of it's not just the technical part that's the problem. In fact, I think the technical part is almost the smallest part of the problem, because we actually have a replacement set of algorithms. The real problem is almost societal. We suck at change. We don't like change. So changing these current algorithms for these new ones, it's going to take us forever. So like everything else, genie flying out of bottles. And then we're going to be like, oh, maybe we should figure out which algorithms we use. And that problem is my real worry, is that we are not good at adapting to these new threats quickly enough to counter them.
Quantum decryption, it's more, we didn't change even when we thought it was a huge threat, like Y2K. And so now what do you want the takeaway then for, you've got a decision maker in an organization, maybe not even in a technical realm. What are some of the things you think today that they need to be taking action on, especially as it relates to potential quantum decryption, that they shouldn't be waiting for that possible future to arrive? They should be making decisions today.
I was lucky to be part of the World Economic Forum's group that wrote a few papers on this subject. So both on the state of quantum computing, as well as on the transition to a post-quantum economy. What are the things that you would need to do for your organization? And it spells out very clear language specifically for those executives, how they need to get their organizations ready. There's also more technical documentation, because I'm also part of the European Technical Standards Institute, that also has released a bunch of advice on, what does that mean in terms of algorithms? How do you look at doing discovery of your current encryption, as well as making this transition plan? I also did a talk with NIST, the National Institutes of Technology in the United States, to make sure that we have that transition plan very clearly expressed. So there are a lot of resources out there. If there is one takeaway, it is maybe just get started now. Not to wait too much before you take a look at those documents or try to figure out what your strategy is here. Just don't wait. Because the technology is running to try to make advances here, and it would be a shame if we didn't prioritize this thing until it became urgent.
What's happening then, or what could happen in a possible future at the intersection of AI, quantum, and security?
So we know that we have an extended military-industrial complex that isn't always the most rapid at change, and that we have a lot of tech debt there historically that always accumulates. So I think that's one area. Of course, healthcare is another area. And again, when I say the most vulnerable, it's that, but it's also really like critical infrastructure. And this is going to sound silly, but I mean, every single area where you could imagine that there is a strategic advantage to bringing down infrastructure. So having an availability threat of things that we need from an energy, water, healthcare perspective. The point about quantum computing is it's there for all of our operations. If we ever did anything remote, if we did anything involving enterprise operations, it is a threat there as well. So just have your company and your infrastructure running, then it is relevant to look at what is happening with post-quantum cryptography. And that's something that I think people very often tend to dismiss, because they're often in the camp of, oh, I've got nothing to hide. We're not doing a bunch of super secret information. We're not banks. And I think that's the challenge, is to try to understand it is for everyone. not just those few people that they think have only a little bit of information to protect. It's obviously most urgent for those because that intellectual property is also in danger, or that PII is also in danger, but it is also for everyone running like a large scale operation across the scope of the internet.
If I'm sort of parsing a lot of the things that you're talking about, there's always these technological advances, but then there's always the human factor, right? I became fascinated by cybersecurity or early technology security in the 1970s when the highest level of cracking technology was something called, there's a guy named John Thomas Draper who was called Captain Crunch, and he literally used these little whistles from cereal boxes, but a lot of the to be able to simulate phone tones, to be able to make free long distance phone calls, but a lot of the vulnerabilities come from people and their own behaviors. So as we start thinking about this, not just cybersecurity future, but quantum future, are the things in terms of our own personal behavior, or the way that we think about the protection of our own data and that sort of thing, that we should be preparing for that possible future?
Absolutely. Until recently, the biggest AI threats we were seeing were something called domain generating algorithms. And they were being used basically to spin up domains, like literally domains on the internet, like kyz123.com, but they were being spun up so rapidly by these algorithms that defenders who usually sinkhole these algorithms and make them unavailable weren't able to catch up because these algorithms be generated too quickly because they were being done. Until recently, the biggest AI threats we were seeing were something called domain generating algorithms. And they were being used basically to spin up domains, like literally domains on the internet, like kyz123.com, but they were being spun up so rapidly by these algorithms that defenders who usually sinkhole these algorithms and make them unavailable weren't able to catch up because they were done by an algorithm. I spoke to the CISO at Black Hat a little while ago. He was on my panel and we were talking about AI threats, and Black Hat is a cybersecurity conference. Anyway, the point is that during that session, it became really clear the CISO was very much security minded, of course, but also fraud minded. So they had already thought about what are the ways that there could be potentially fraud executed against our finance team. They had really good processes in place, but it didn't counter the deep fake threat that they encountered, where then subsequently a finance employee transferred 25 million to another bank account based on a conversation over Zoom that he thought he was having with his CFO. And I say he, but not gender specific. So the fact is that this happened, and I think those kinds of threats will be far more prevalent. But it's not only the deep fakes. It's not only the deep fakes in voice and video, etc. I actually worry about other types of ransomware, multi-vector or like different types of attacks that can converge that are being created by an AI. Also, the ability for code, we always call the polymorphic, when code can rapidly evolve and change to be there for all different types of operating systems, making it harder for us to define. I worry about our ability to catch them using our current mechanisms of defense, like our EDRs, like our a detection and response capacity, not only on our human side, but on our technical side. A lot of our detection is still signature based. So I'm hoping that AI will evolve quickly enough for the defenders, but then that means the uptake needs to be there as well. That we need to somehow, and this is a ballsy thing, I want to be very clear, it's not that easy for most security officers to do, is to actually allow AI to come into their networks to do some form of autonomous defense. It's not easy because you need to now trust these things. And that getting that trust in these engines is more difficult, I would argue, right now for defenders than it is for attackers. It is way easier for attackers to be like, I trust it, let's use it to generate an attack, than for defenders to have that same level of trust to say, I trust it, let's use it for defense. So although I think there is a certain capacity, I think it requires courage and conviction on those that are doing the defending against AI.
So now, is there a possible future where you wave a magic wand and suddenly there's a quantum internet where everything connected to everything else uses quantum technology. Is that even a possible future?
Well, that is certainly one of the aspirations of the European Quantum Flagship, was to be able to say at a basic communications level. So if you imagine that, you have different levels of communication, like in this stack, and that at the transmission level, that you were already having really good, strong cryptography at the transmission level, both terrestrial as well as from satellite. If we could say that we could do that, and again, that is the goal, that's already a really good thing. It doesn't obviate the need to also have good security and encryption at the application level, or at another level in the protocol stack for when you would transmit to a very specific party with a very specific threat level. It doesn't obviate that. So it's still about practicing defense in depth. But the point is that you would start out of the gate with pretty good security. That's a nice thing to have. So if you get out of the gate with already your transmission level security being taken care of, that means not anyone and their mother can suddenly intercept that communications and walk away. That's already a good thing. And then subsequently, you could have other levels of security that would actually allow you to pad on to that effort. So it only gets better and better. It's a really funny story. I just want to tell you quickly, Gary, like I was in Kyiv in Ukraine, I think, is it a week ago? I don't know. My sense of time is a bit broken, but it's either a week ago or 2 weeks ago, I was in Kyiv. And in order to get there, because the airport is bombed, so you can't fly there, you have to take a train from Warsaw. So fly into Warsaw and then take a train to Chelm and then take the overnight train from there into Kyiv. And what's really funny is you have to stop midway because they have to change the train track carriage thing, because they've made it so you can't ride your train in between Poland and Ukraine. And they did that because they didn't want an easy invasion capacity. So, pretty unhandy for interoperability, if we think about it that way, but pretty smart when you think about it from a defense angle. So I think we need to make choices also on our internet infrastructure. What degree do we find interoperability more important than we find secrecy?
So the possible futures, so you mentioned communication, but you've got the possibility of quantum entanglement, spooky action at a distance. Can you just explain briefly what that is? And then will that enable potentially communications, this sci-fi level of, communicating across space or that sort of thing? Or how do you think about some of the potential for communications in a quantum future?
This is the wrong answer or wrong question to ask me, to be really honest, because I would love, I don't know, have you read Ender's Game? Yeah. So I don't know if you remember, they had, what was it called again in Ender's Game? They had an entanglement device. Yeah, I'm forgetting the name now, but they had an entanglement device that allowed you to communicate across the universe by using entanglement. Right now, that does not work because it violates relativity. So it actually violates reality. You can't do it. So there is no communication. Entanglement is entanglement. And it absolutely is spooky action at a distance. And Ronald Hansen at Hansen Lab at the University of Delft is the one who proved that over an arbitrary distance of 4 kilometers, he actually managed to show how entanglement worked and that it did work. And there was like a loophole-free Bell test that he conducted, and it's published in Nature. I'm probably misquoting a bunch of things because this was a while ago when I read this paper. But it is fascinating, and I wish we could use it for communication, but pretty much everyone who actually is a physicist says you can't. So we got to trust them that you can.
So maybe not a possible future. Last question. Jaya wakes up 10, 15 years from now. What does a day look like?
You want the dystopia or, the utopia?
Let's start with the positive. Let's start with the utopian version.
I'm hoping that, we've established this notion of a global federation, that we no longer prescribe to these things. And in order for the advancement of civilization, we have managed, thanks to quantum computing and to AI and to a benevolent custodianship of robotic engineers who are helping us sort all this stuff and move us along, that we've managed to do a couple of things really well. We figured out not just how to get to AGI, but we've also figured out how to do intelligent augmentation for ourselves. And I'm not talking about the biohacking where you figure out where magnetic true north is. I'm talking about genuinely expanding our capacities, all of the things that make us human, but better. I'm hoping that for our future, because I think that otherwise it will be very difficult not to compete, but to maintain our humanity in the face of some of these other advancements. I've got to be very honest. I think that it's already difficult sometimes to maintain our humanity in our current set of circumstances. I think it'll be more difficult to maintain and assert that humanity as technology evolves. So my hope is that we have that capacity to heal our planet while venturing forward to explore others.
Thanks for taking the time to step into the future with me. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we'll be back next week with Kyle Hermans to explore how exponential change isn't just reshaping technology, it's reshaping us.